Yeah. Get my clicker. Come on. There we go. All right, gentlemen, all 80 of us, we'll kick things off with a quote. Insanity is doing the same thing over and over and expecting different results, something that's attributed to Mr. Albert Einstein. So how is that relevant to sustainability? Folks that are concerned with sustainability recognize that a change is necessary, and we're not going to get that change by doing the same thing over and over and expecting different results. Something needs to be different. And so when I put this presentation together, it was with the intention of challenging the audience to think differently. So as we're going over the various elements that are in the Tanzu portfolio, think how they can be used in whatever situation to help reduce either your footprint or your customer's footprint. So that's the takeaway, that's your mission for today. I've already introduced myself to the entire audience, but we'll do it for the sake of the camera. I'm Vern Blinius. By day, I am a lead solution architect for VMware Cloud on AWS, but I also wear my ambassador of the CTO, Office of the CTO hat, where I focus on sustainability initiatives, hence the presentation today. Yes, following the illustrious lead of Mr. Chris Story at Keynote today at VMUG, I am putting up the disclaimer, which effectively says anything I say shouldn't be held against me in a court of law. The packed agenda is the why, the how, and the I told you so. So for why, and I think it's important that we always start with why, is why we're doing this. What led us to, gentlemen, welcome. No, this is good. We've doubled our audience participation.
Sit right here. Sit right here.
Oh, I might actually restart.
Nice to see you.
Oh, they're all flooding in.
Oh, flooding is a relative term, but that's okay. I'm going to back up. You guys get to see the first 3 slides again.
Is that what you see like?
No, that is exactly what I look like with that hair, and in 10 years. Okay, 5 years.
Sorry.
This feels better already.
What are you saying about this?
I'm saying we've doubled the we've doubled the niceness, the capacity of the audience. Oh. I had a shower this morning.
Don't want to put you off.
All good. All right. Guys, welcome. Thanks for joining. I know there's some tough competition across the way with Mr. Epping doing vSAN. Don't get up and leave now just because I told you that was happening. I just presented this quote a moment ago that insanity is doing the same thing over and over and expecting different results. And related to sustainability, I think that those who care about sustainability recognize that change is required. We're not going to get that change if we're doing the same thing over and over and expecting different results. So the challenge, the takeaway is as we go over the bits of the Tanzu portfolio, the Tanzu solution, thinking how those elements could actually help you or your customers lower carbon footprint, right? So that's the thought. This is not by design a technical presentation. It's just let's think differently about some things using elements of Tanzu. So, welcome to, and appropriately named, Exploring VMware Tanzu and Sustainability. I'm Vern Blinius. By day, I'm a lead cloud solution architect for VMware Cloud on AWS, but I also wear my hat as an ambassador of the Office of the CTO, where I focus on sustainability initiatives, and that's what led us here today. So, before we get into the meat of it, for the second time now, I'm going to do the disclaimer, just because Chris Story did it. I'm like, I should probably put it in. Anything I say may or may not be true. That's effectively what this says. And don't hold me or VMware responsible for any forward-looking statements. Right. Packed agenda, why, how, and I told you so. Why, starting with why is it important, how we got to the stage, why are we looking at sustainability, and what is VMware, what are we ourselves doing about sustainability? We had a question on that, discussion on that earlier. How, the elements of the Tanzu portfolio and how they can help lower sustainability score. And now I told you so, I have a good case reference from a customer who's used Tanzu, not only to lower their carbon footprint, but also save a bunch of money. So those are the why, how, I told you so. Hold all your questions. Kidding. By all means, if we have a question, we have time, fire away as we go. Don't hesitate to interrupt, okay? Except for you, Paul. So starting with the why, the mission. Most of you know this. In the United Nations Summit on Climate Change in 2015, 195 countries got together and decided that, yes, we are in fact harming the planet. We should probably try to do something about that. And out of that spun up several different initiatives at different levels. So at the governmental level, yes, Will?
I do have a question.
Yes.
So didn't the US pull out of the Paris Accord? And if they did, being a US company, how did VMware sit in that?
So then they did come back into the Paris Accord later. And it rightly caused quite the kerfuffle, right, when the US pulled out. We, VMware, didn't receive any slack from that or any flack from that, in that we kept true. You'll see in a moment, we've still published our 2030 agenda, and so we stayed true to our guns, okay? With or without Trump involved in the situation. So the initiatives, some arguably more forceful than others that came out of this, were at different levels. So they were at the governmental level, the individual level, but for the sake of the conversation today, at the corporate level. And so for that, it's important to illustrate that I'm not just talking the talk, or VMware is not just talking the talk. We have some serious skin in the game when it comes to sustainability. We've published our 2030 agenda, which we call 30 by 30, so 30 goals in each of the areas of sustainability, equity, and trust as part of our wider ESG, environmental, social, and governance initiative. You can see here, everything from, I just had to use this spotlight, and that's what it's about. Everything from workload carbon efficiency through to making it very transparent as far as our carbon usage is concerned, zero carbon cloud program, right through to advocating for sustainability in public policy. And we're making really, really good progress in this. We've had all kinds of accolades, and it's within our culture and it's within our products. Our execs themselves have incentives to meet, have targets to meet to get their comp line, so they're incented. This is how we're doing. This is a bit of an eye chart. I like it though, because it covers sustainability from in this case, from 2011 through to 2019. A couple of things just to call out. Already back in 2011, our Palo Alto data center was at 100% clean energy. Fast forward to 2018. We were certified carbon neutral 2 years ahead of schedule. But the real numbers, I think, that tell the tale are these on the top. 340 million, 664, 1.2 billion metric tons of CO2 emissions avoided through use of VMware technologies. Okay, so it's baked into our products, it's baked into what we do, it's baked into the culture, so we are very, very committed to sustainability. I like this chart. I know it's old, because the numbers are 2012. And did anyone see the VMware Explorer keynote with, the part that had Kit Colbert, our CTO? Okay, so Kit brought up some numbers, which are more modern than these. But what I like about this is that it shows that if we, the IT community, were a country, we would be the third largest consumer of electricity on the planet. And that's back in 2012. It's come further since then. The 2% usage of the world's electricity is now closer to 3-4%. We use more, or we emit more CO2 than the airline industry, and no one's going to argue that it's diminishing. In fact, the stat that Kit used was that between now and 2030, we'll double our consumption of electricity. Okay, so with these numbers, if there's anything that we can do to think differently, to lower it in any way, shape, or form, we should probably take that initiative. It's not just about the right thing to do. At Explorer, when I gave this presentation, I did this, and I said, it's for those of you that think it's the right thing to do, and that's the sole driver, isn't that cute? There is a very big, substantial backing financially to this. So on the left the 110 trillion, that's investor dollars. So investment companies that are looking to invest in green funds, looking for companies that have a good green score, a good record with their targets, their CO2 targets, and that they're meeting those targets. Only then are those companies going to get a piece of that $110 trillion. Every company wants investment. So they need it. It's imperative, it behooves them to have a good carbon rating. On the other side, the 5.5 trillion, that's supply chain dollars. So if you as an organization want to be part of someone's supply chain, provide them with your services or your products, they are probably disinterested in you if you don't have a good carbon score, a good carbon rating, because your CO2 emissions become their CO2 emissions. And again, if you want part of that $5.5 trillion pot, you have to have a good carbon track record. In fact, VMware is committed, we of course have a supply chain as well, we've committed to 75% of our supply chain dollars to partners that have a good carbon rating. There's always going to be a little bit, we can't, this particular provider is something that no other provider provides, so we're going to have to spend even though they don't have as good a carbon rating. But 75% of our dollars are going only to supply chain partners that have a good carbon record. Right, with that, let me define sustainability as we define it in our 2030 plan, so our 30 by 30 goals. Under sustainability, I'll read it out, sustainable digital infrastructure, supporting the transition to net zero emissions and decarbonization for our customers, supply chain, and operations. So that is what we're talking about when we talk about sustainability in this context. Okay? Pause for a sec before we get into the sustainability through Tanzu and the how. Thoughts, questions? We have a small enough audience here that we can have a chat. Will, I see you ruminating, but Paul put his hand up.
So another driver is regulation. So with my FSI hat on, I'm getting door knocks on a regular basis from FSI customers wanting to understand how they can, from a procurement perspective, improve their supply chain, and they need to do it.
So for those that didn't hear, Paul works with the financial sector, and in the procurement chain, or speaking to the procurement officers in FSI, there's a big push towards accepting only partners that have a good carbon rating.
And just to add, it's from a regulatory perspective.
From a regulatory perspective. So they need to do that.
Yes.
Yeah. It's good to see, right? Because this just raises the entire issue up.
So on that point then, so under sustainability,
yeah.
are we looking at it based on the carbon emissions, or are we looking at it more granularly on actual sustainability? The reason I say that is Tesla makes a lot of its money through selling carbon credits to other companies whose output is higher. So to meet regulation, could you just buy a load of carbon credits and go tick the box?
In some cases, I think that's probably yes.
There's a subtle difference between them, and they do distinguish between them.
Okay.
So, but that's the interesting thing, like carbon zero versus net zero. The difference being, at some point you can't just keep trading carbon credits, right? At some point you actually do have to lower the emissions of what you put out, or using electricity from a provider and what they put out. And so carbon credits are great, but this is about actually lowering emissions. Fair point. So Tanzu has a broad portfolio. We're not going to talk about all of Tanzu. How many are familiar with Tanzu or have used Tanzu? Steve, you were saying earlier. Gents, at all? Yes, no? Bits? Okay. So a lot of services within Tanzu. Tanzu Kubernetes Grid is the Tanzu runtime, all the way down through Tanzu Mission Control, which allows you to manage and spin up multiple Kubernetes clusters in the same pane of glass. All of the portfolio is geared towards getting code into container, into production as quickly as possible. So build, run, manage. But for the purpose of sustainability, I want to focus on 3 areas. I want to focus on Tanzu as far as awareness, as far as conservation, and as far as efficiency are concerned. And we'll look at different elements of Tanzu for each of those. Everyone get ready. It's audience participation time. So if you think you're here for relaxing time, think again. For awareness, before we go into this, a little anecdote on awareness, which to me drives home how awareness can change behavior. In my world before VMware, and yes, there was a world before VMware, I was working for a value-added reseller, a VAR, in Canada. A new colleague, a new hire, joined us, and he brought with him his mobile phone, which he owned, but also the plan, the mobile phone plan that was set up for him by his previous company, who took care of the invoice, and he never saw it. It was true in the new company as well, where we were both now working, that accounting took care of the phone bill, but it wasn't long before he got a tap on the shoulder asking him why his phone bill was twice as much as anybody else's. He was surprised, but for the first time ever, he was provided the invoice, and he looked at it, realized there were services that he didn't need that were just a hangover from his previous company. He made some quick changes and reduced it by half, and all was well. The point being, he was made aware, and through the awareness, he had a measurement and he could take action. And that's what we're talking about here. So for awareness, I want to focus on the artist formerly known as Wavefront, and then formerly known as Tanzu Observability, and now currently known as ARIA Operations for Applications, which is too long to say, and so I might just revert to Wavefront. So, Wavefront is capable of ingesting thousands of data points per second, analyzing them from the context of the virtual machine, of the container, of the underlying hardware, and provide metrics that go to a dashboard. You can use that dashboard for root cause analysis, last mile troubleshooting, providing it to execs. This is how our whole application is hanging together. But importantly in this case, it also surfaces the power consumption and the conversion to CO2 emissions metrics, and you can put those up in a dashboard and view them in real time or over time. Case in point, phones please. If you can't capture, excuse me, if you can't capture the QR code at the bottom here, I have the URL, loadgen, LOADGEN, .chrisbox, KRISBOX.org. The reason it's called Chrisbox is this demo, the front end and the back end, comes to us courtesy of Mr. Chris Clark, a most excellent VMware colleague from the US, so shout out to Chris for putting this together. So when you bring this up, what's going to happen is you're going to get a landing page that says there are 1 users, 2 users, 3 users. By all means, keep refreshing that. And I'll break out of the presentation. What you're going to see, or what you're doing, is you're spinning up containers. Those containers have a pod within a container, and that pod is an app that is going out looking for prime numbers, specifically Mersenne primes, so 2 to the n minus 1. So it's a lot of churn, a lot of CPU usage. The more CPU usage, the more power you're using. And what we'll see, we're seeing some fluctuation here going up, but what we'll see is eventually this will just keep going up and up and up. So we're seeing real-time usage of the electricity consumption on the underlying hosts that are hosting our Kubernetes cluster. All right, and this is just one app, right? Here we go. Now we're off the scale and still going up. So thank you. What does it say now? How many users?
40.
Okay. So this is real-time CO2 and electrical consumption. We're being made aware of what that looks like. So thank you, guys. Going back to the slide.
So is this a little bit like smart meters in your home?
It's a lot like smart metering at home. And that is an excellent example. I know you have a smart meter at home, right?
It's the smartest thing ever.
I haven't met Dina, Ilo, or Ralph, but so far I'm with you. So it is, if we look, this will also do this over time, right? So if you wanted to go and take a look at what your carbon footprint looked like over time, you can use Tanzu Observability, Wavefront, to go and see that cycle. Now take a theoretical example. I've made this number up. It's not what we just saw now, but it's not unrealistic as far as what power usage in a data center might be. So 120 kilowatt hours, or roughly 28 kilograms of CO2 emissions per hour. What if, and here's where we think differently, what if we could just shave 10% off that? Knock that down from 28 to 25 kilograms of CO2 emissions per hour. That would be a huge savings over time, just because we were made aware, and now that we can measure it, we can fix it. You can't fix what you can't measure. I know organizations where the development teams or the application architects are incented financially to try to squeeze down the carbon footprint. And something like this would allow them to do that. So that's awareness. Tanzu observability. Thoughts, questions? I like the smart meter analogy because that's exactly what that's about, raising awareness for that.
So is there a way to say, if I've got a VM that's running, your fat OS with an application on it, and then I can containerize that application? So the thing for me is I'd want to be able to say that I've got all these VMs running like this. If I put them on Tanzu, this is how my footprint will change.
So containerized, so it's interesting thought, and I've heard that argument before. So if you take a VM, and it's full fat VM, then you're stripping that down into a container. So not only are you removing some of the complexity, containers, because they're smaller and can be stacked up on the underlying hardware, are inherently more efficient. So if you can do that, and of course you'd want to measure the before and after, but if you can do that and take a look at that container footprint and the energy that it's used, you would find, in all likelihood, that you are more efficient, that you have more green energy. Does that answer the question?
Yeah.
Or the comment? Cool. Okay, next up, Tanzu and Knative by way of conservation. Is anyone familiar with Knative? Okay, few. So Knative is not actually part of Tanzu. It's an open source thing, but it can sit on top of Tanzu. It's an abstraction on top of Kubernetes that is geared for serverless computing. And the reason that it is of interest from a conservation perspective, it allows something that native Kubernetes doesn't allow, and that is you can monitor your traffic and scale your number of pods in your application to absolute zero, hence conservation. Here's what this looks like. On the right here, this colorful diagram comes to us courtesy of a lady by the name of Whitney Lee, who has a series called Enlightenment, where she uses lightboards, hence Enlightenment, to break down Kubernetes concepts into things that are simple. It's really a good series. If you have any Kubernetes questions, by all means, Enlightenment, Whitney Lee, take a look. So in this case, with Knative, what's happening is the Knative service is sitting on top of the Kubernetes clusters. There's a root associated with it, or a route, depending on which side of the pond. That's the Canadian coming out. Or the American, but in this case, the Canadian coming out. There's a route. It's monitoring the traffic through that route, and it's controlling which revision the traffic is going to, which replica set, which deployment. And if it sees no traffic coming down that pipe, it takes the pods that are running here and reduces them to zero. And so now, again, going back to our previous numbers, our 120 kilowatt hours could go down to zero. Yes, I know that it's kind of an artificial extraction or abstraction. The point being, you actually have the possibility to reduce the carbon footprint by reducing your number of running containers, reducing your electrical consumption. Again, remember, this is about thinking differently. How can we use Tanzu? There are other products, but how do we use Tanzu to think differently to reduce our carbon footprint? So there's the conservation side. And so for the third, for the efficiency, I want to introduce, well, not introduce, I want to talk about the Tanzu build service. Again, anyone familiar with Tanzu build service? Paul? Anyone else? Yes? Some nods? So Tanzu build service, its goal is to automate the creation, management, and governance of containers and do that at scale. It doesn't replace your CI/CD pipeline. In the small eye chart I have here, there's the Tanzu build service there, and you can see how it fits in with the rest of your CI/CD workflow. So it's not replacing it, it's augmenting it. And the key with this, and where sustainability comes in, is that it can be used through automation to radically reduce the time spent on lifecycle management of your containers. It uses something called cloud native build packs, which for those of you who are not familiar with that, you can think them as Docker files on steroids, so more geared towards enterprise scale out. And here's the way this works. What I put up on the left here is a container registry. I've used Harbor, which is the Tanzu product, but it doesn't have to be. It can be any compatible registry. In that registry, we have, let's say, hundreds or thousands of images. Those images are being used for containers. The containers are out in the wild running your application. I painted this out as a three-layer stack. So the bottom is going to be our In the blue is going to be our OS image, the middle, let's say our dependencies, and the top is going to be our application stack. Across thousands, all based on the same, let's say, Linux distribution. Suddenly, an exploit comes up. A vulnerability is discovered in that underlying OS. Well, if you have a problem with one, you have a problem with all of them. So you need to do something about it. You're going to go and you're going to fix it. You're going to either patch that OS or you're going to slide a new OS underneath that, maybe a different version of Linux or upgraded version of Linux. You do that once. Tanzu Build Service is monitoring that change. It can be set to monitor the base. It can be set to monitor code changes. And having made it once, Tanzu Build Service then goes out and changes them on all of the rest of the images automatically. And this could literally be thousands of images off of which your containers are based, running in production. So now that you've gone and changed all these images, you can use your favorite CI, well, the CD portion of your pipeline, and get those back out into production. Again, having made just one change. So radical efficiency through use of Tanzu Build Service. So those are the three. So awareness, conservation, efficiency. And now for the I told you so piece of our detailed agenda, I want to highlight what one specific customer has done. We're not mentioning the customer, but here's a little bit of background. They're a mining corporation. They have targeted some serious CO2 initiatives. They want to reduce their Scope 1 and Scope 2 emissions by 2030, and closer in time, by 2025, a 15% reduction. About 15% reduction from their 2018 baseline. Is everyone familiar with Scope 1 and Scope 2? Some yes, some no. All right, simply put, Scope 1 emissions, CO2 emissions, are the ones that you as your corporation are directly responsible for. Let's say you're a manufacturing agency. You're making a product. In making that product, you're burning carbon fuels. Those are your Scope 1 emissions. You're directly responsible for those emissions. Scope 2 emissions are generally attributed to your electrical supplier. So if you're using a company whose grid is powered off clean energy, you're good to go. Or tidal energy, solar energy, wind energy. But if they're burning carbon fuel themselves, they're creating emissions. Those emissions are your Scope 2 emissions because you're using them, so they count negatively against you and your carbon score. So there's Scope 1 and Scope 2, and Scope 3 emissions, loosely put, are everything else in your supply chain. Okay, so if you have, you hire a truck company to go and deliver stuff, DHL. You hire DHL, what DHL is emitting, that's part of your supply chain, so that counts as your Scope 3. So, Scope 1 and Scope 2, they want to radically reduce them. And here's their process. When you're mining, this is specifically with their aluminum, or on this side of the pond, aluminium. The aluminium mining starts with mining the raw ore, bauxite. Bauxite gets refined into something called alumina. Alumina then gets smelted into aluminium, which then becomes the products that we know and we use. The problem that they're having, well, this first part is not the problem. Simply, the smelting process takes up a huge amount of electrical power. There's no way around that. But what they were experiencing is that they were getting spikes in that use of electricity. And they couldn't account for why these spikes were occurring. And it was bad on two fronts. First, it doesn't fit in very well with their carbon track record. Their CO2 has said, this is where we're going to be, that 50% reduction. This isn't helping. Secondly, they pay a fixed amount for electricity every month. And these spikes are going beyond that amount, and so they're paying overages, and the overages are horribly expensive. So for both of those, they really want to know why this is occurring and how to fix it. So what they did is they met with the VMware Tanzu team, and a machine learning AI project was proposed in which they would first come up with a minimally viable product in phase 1 here, and to understand what was actually happening. And then in phase 2, they were going to have an energy optimization app to take care of the issue, and then expand that further down the road with phase 3. So what they did is they put in a Kubernetes platform. They used TKG, so our runtime. They used also, as part of the Tanzu portfolio, Greenplum for their database. They got their minimal viable product, their MVP. They moved to phase 2 where they introduced other elements of the portfolio, and they're still in phase 3 now. And it was hugely effective. So not only did they start to manage their electrical consumption better, understanding what that issue was, they saved over $2 million, which is a big deal, and they're in line with their CO2's stated and published objectives for their carbon footprint. And they have planned expansion. Now, full disclosure, I did this at Explore last week, and one of the bits of feedback, and kudos to whoever did it, said, yeah, but you know what? They could have used anything to build that ML AI project. They didn't have to use Tanzu. Fair point. They could have done that. But they did use Tanzu, and the reason they used Tanzu was because it was easy and quick for them to stand up their Kubernetes cluster. The elements of the Tanzu portfolio were what they needed to make the difference and make the change quickly. So arguably, they used Tanzu effectively to help them with their carbon footprint and with their dollar savings. So there's the I told you so. So coming full circle, awareness, conservation, and efficiency through Tanzu. Remember, the idea here is to think differently. There's something here that tweaks something in your brain, saying, you know what, Vern was talking about this in the presentation. Maybe it's something we could leverage, that we could use to reduce the carbon footprint. But we can't start with a quote and not end with a quote. So, from Einstein to Puff Daddy, it's okay to be crazy. Just don't be insane. Right. Thoughts? Comments? We've actually had some good discussion here, and I appreciate that. But anyone, thoughts, comments? Did I answer the question? As on we were talking earlier about VMware products and how Tanzu can affect that?
I mean, I do, in fact, have a question in regards to you mentioned about these key stakeholders that you take on board who are meeting their initiative objectives. And where does that leave those stakeholders that are not quite there yet?
Okay, so the question was...
meeting their carbon footprint or whatever initiative they have in place before we get there.
So Jez's question was, we talk about stakeholders that we work with, that come on board, that have carbon published goals. What happens with those that don't? The short answer is harsh.
It doesn't happen overnight, does it?
No, it doesn't. So the way it works, often for corporations, is when a company who wants some of that investment dollar, who wants to be someone's supply chain, they need to up their carbon game or lower their carbon game. What they'll do is they will establish science-based targets. So there's an actual institution called the Science-Based Targets Institute, which works with a corporation for very little money. It's not quite a nonprofit, but it's a small amount of money to help them, establish actual realistic carbon goals, and then those goals get published. Often they're published to something called CDP, the Carbon Disclosure Project. Those are the numbers that I use, the 110 trillion and the 5.5 trillion are from the CDP's website. So the Carbon Disclosure Project then goes and publishes those and holds that company accountable to that whatever target they committed. And there are different targets you can commit to. One of the most stringent ones is you commit to keeping global warming below 1.5 degrees. So it doesn't want to go up by more than 1.5 degrees Celsius. And you need to do all this within your organization to meet that goal scientifically, to make sure it doesn't go above 1.5. And then you're tracked. And the whole concept, or the whole newly emerging science of carbon accounting, is a big deal because there's lots of money at stake. And so how do you prove your scope 1, your scope 2, especially when it gets confusing? Your scope, so going back to the scope 2 example, your electrical provider, well, their emissions become your scope 2 emissions, except their emissions are their scope 1 emissions. And so if you're taking into account all the emissions, how do you not double count that? And in going back to the conversation earlier with Paul, the financial services industry, I read the other day that when the bank provides you with a mortgage for a house, and so you're the owner of that house, your emissions from that house become the bank's problem from a scope 2 perspective. And you're thinking, okay, that's just going to get really complex. And it does. It gets really complex. Hence, the whole need to track carbon, do carbon accounting effectively, and all the institutions that have arisen to properly track carbon. So we're going back to the point, companies that want to raise their public level or raise the level of awareness, say, look, we're doing the right thing, they publish it, and only then can they actually be measured properly and be tracked by other organizations that are looking to partner with them. And so that's how they move themselves forward, to your question. That's how they move themselves forward on the carbon scale. Does that answer it?
Yeah.
Cool.
I assume at some point, if not already, there will be fines levied against companies that don't meet targets, because it will be
A necessary thing.
A continent thing, a global thing. The question then is, where does that money go?
So Will's comment is, at some point in time, you would think that there would be fines levied against companies that don't meet carbon objectives that have been set by some regulatory body, perhaps at the governmental level. And so if that's the case, where do those fines go? To my bank account.
Yeah.
If
VMware.
only. If only. So it's a great question. I don't have an answer for that, but I can speculate. Like, we can speculate together. Paul, do you know?
Government.
Yeah. I mean,
It's a regulatory, it's a fine. that's
The
levied by
regulatory
regulatory bodies.
body. That's where I would go with that.
But at the moment, they're not fining. At the moment, it's incentive-based. But down the line, there will be fines.
the only disappointing thing about that is it will go into a central government pot rather than being carved off as green funds.
I agree.
To pay for future green investment rather than going to selling guns to some other. You know what I mean? It'll go into that horror pot rather than yeah.
Although I don't know if that's the optimist in you speaking, Will.
Always.
For those that know Will, that was probably one of the most optimistic things we've heard, in the past 2 weeks?
Yeah.
So I don't know if that's necessarily going to be true. Because there's such a focus on green initiatives, there may very well be a pot that's carved up for it and put in that pot to fund future green initiatives. It may not, but
It's more about like when the money comes in, it won't be funneled directly to that pot. It will sit into central, and then they'll
they'll divvy some of that up. That could easily be the case.
One-to-one correlation.
No, probably not.
So it's worth pointing out that we're not at the stage of fines at the moment.
But I do see that coming. I absolutely agree that's coming.
2-3 years down the line, if not 5. But the idea to start with is to incentivize companies to do the right thing by making it mandatory for others to invest only in the companies that
have the green score.
Yeah. There's a very interesting global dynamic on this, because the US, you cannot talk about this at the moment without getting some political grief. It is a very polarizing debate.
I mean, if you look at in the IT industry, 2/3 of what we buy probably gets made in China, which is probably the worst.
Well, they also, China have the most rapid green energy production in the world, and they do more than anyone else. So they might be producing the most disposable electronic waste, but they're also doing the most good stuff as well. So it's
Solar panels.
yeah, well, yeah.
I should mention, some of you may know, this is being recorded for a YouTube channel. Gareth has put up the recording. So for anyone following along the recording afterwards, we're happy to have an extended conversation along sustainability. I was mentioning earlier that we have, even our execs are incented by a target, a green target as part of their comp plan. Within the office of the CTO, there's actually a sustainability division, if you will. We have a VP of ESG, of enterprise, of environment, social, and governance. And so by all means, contact us if you have any questions on sustainability. We'd be more than happy to have that dialogue. Okay. I think I'm on reasonably-ish on time. We started a little late, but thanks everyone for joining. I appreciate the fact that the room started with 2 and now has more than 2. I like that. And it's an important subject, so it's good to air out some thoughts and hear some ideas and have a dialogue. So thanks everyone.